Welcome, welcome. We are going to give it a couple minutes for folks to roll on, but we'd love to know who's here with us. So if you don't mind dropping your community name in the chat and let us know what the best thing is that you've had to eat this month. I know for those of us on the West Coast, we're still gearing up towards lunch, but yeah, we'd love to hear what folks have had to eat. Awesome. Kat, we're going to need that salsa recipe from you. Welcome, y'all. Looks like we've got some more folks rolling in. Oh, man. I'm working up an appetite here reading through all of these. That sounds fantastic. So glad to have all of you with us. For those who've just joined, we're just going to take a couple of minutes to give folks time to roll in here. I know the plenary session just got out a few minutes ago, but we'd love to hear from you in the chat. So let us know who you are, where you're from, and what the best thing is that you've had to eat this month. Working up an appetite. And Andrew, just seeing you asked about whether the session's going to be recorded. Definitely. Session's being recorded, and we'll share the slides and some materials after the fact for sure. Of course. Welcome, y'all. All right. I know we've got some folks still trickling in, but it looks like we've got about a critical mass. Over 100 folks are on the line with us. So maybe we can go ahead and get started. So just a reminder, folks are going to be largely on mute during the session, but would love to hear from you in the chat anytime. So feel free to drop us a line if you have any questions or if anything's coming up from you. And our hope is really that today is going to feel a little bit like a workshop. So I think we're doing our best to use the virtual tools available to us and to hopefully be able to get a lot of input and feedback and great discussion from all of you. So I thought we'd start with just some quick intros. And for folks who've just joined, please let us know who you are and your favorite food that you've had in the last month in the chat. But wanted to make sure you had a chance to get to know the folks who are going to be sort of facilitating the conversation today. So my name is Aras Fazan. I'm based in Los Angeles, and I'm part of the Built for Zero data team. I'll pass it over to Caitlin, Kavya, Shantae, and Esther to do quick intros. Caitlin.
Great. Hi, my name is Caitlin Bear. I am a senior data analyst on the Built for Zero data team, and I'm based here in Austin, Texas. I'm going to throw it to Kavya.
Hello, I'm a data solutions analyst on the BFZ team based in Brooklyn, New York. Shantae?
Hi, everyone. I'm Shantae Smith. I'm a systems transformation advisor based in Phoenix, and I will throw it to Esther, last but not least.
Hey, y'all. I'm Esther. I'm the data solutions manager for our team, and I'm based in Los Angeles. pass it back to Abbas.
Awesome. So some of you might be thinking, I sense a theme around a lot of the folks who are staffing this call, and you would be right, which is these may be some relatively unfamiliar faces to some of you, because a lot of the data team folks are working behind the scenes on things like measurement frameworks and tools and dashboards. And so that's part of why we wanted to get this session, to make sure that we had an opportunity to take some of our thinking that our team has sort of co-designed with partners and with some community leaders, and to stress test it with all of you. So here's a quick overview of how we're hoping to spend the bulk of today's agenda. So right now we're in our welcomes and introduction section. Then we're going to do a lightning round 10-minute overview of our current best thinking about how we want to support communities to measure progress towards racial equity in system outcomes. Then we want to spend the bulk of the call, almost an hour, to have a facilitated feedback session and discussion. And so that's really the hope here. I think if we were in person together, and hopefully we will be sometime soon, this would feel like the kind of session where we want people to be engaged and active in a bunch of different activities, sort of on your feet, moving around. And so we're going to try and do our best to make sure that we bring some of that energy to the session. And then we'll close with 10 minutes of just information about next steps and where we're headed. Because the goal is to collect all this feedback and do something with it, and to give you guys line of sight into where we're headed in terms of supporting you around looking at and improving system outcomes through a lens of racial equity. Okay, so with that said, I'm going to take the next 10 minutes or so and walk y'all through our team's current thinking around how communities might want to look at racial equity in homeless response system outcomes. So this slide might be familiar to those of y'all who are with us in October. These are 4 racial equity indicators that we sort of co-designed with partners and communities and folks with lived experience of homelessness. The goal here was really to think about the same way that we do with functional zero. Let's start by thinking about what the end state might look like. And not just the end state in an abstract way, but let's get really concrete. So if I'm talking about one community's homeless response system, what are the things that would tell me if that system is responding to crises at a system level in an equitable way? Well, we landed on 4 indicator lanes. The first one is system decision-making power being equitable. The second one is an equitable lived experience across different groups. The third one is that the community would have quality data around race and ethnicity. And the fourth one, the one that we're going to focus on today, is equity in system outcomes. And so I'll take a second and just drill down here in a second around what specifically we mean by equity in system outcomes. But by way of context, the goal today is really to go from some of these blueprints, some concepts that we've worked to refine and hone with a bunch of input from different stakeholders, and then to start to pivot into thinking about how we would operationalize these and support your communities to operationalize these in the field, right? So I could come up with a shiny, beautiful, perfect definition on a shelf, but if it's almost impossible to actually measure towards that definition, it's not going to be doing me much good. And so just like the frameworks that we've built around quality data and functional zero and measurable reductions are all in the spirit of improvement, we think that it's important that the racial equity definitions that we come up with also feel rooted in that spirit of improvement, that they feel measurable, that they are simple enough that we can have conversations and tether improvement work to them. And so our hope is to get some feedback from y'all about the extent to which the current definitions that we've got that are pretty much in shiny draft form, do they adhere to some of those principles that we think are important? And then to start to learn from y'all about what you're seeing in your communities as you start to dig into the data in the way that we're talking about. So basically, things are very much still under construction, but it feels like we're past due for moving from the blueprint phase into breaking ground and actually starting to roll our sleeves up and dig into the work. We know that lots of your communities are way ahead of us here, so we're hoping to learn from you and with you. Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty here of what we're talking about when we say equity in system outcomes. So if the goal is that racial and ethnic disproportionality is sort of the thing that we're trying to eliminate, and I'll get really explicit here that we're not focused on inflow into homelessness here. We're talking about the homeless response system and how it's responding, and whether the outcomes there are equitable. We heard a lot that there are three main domains we want to focus our attention on, three signals, three areas that would tell us if a system has sort of equity in terms of how it's meeting people's needs. Those three measures are housing placements, returns to homelessness, and average length of time. And so we wanted to really hone in there and think about, for these three domains, what would it mean for disproportionality to be eliminated? And so here we did a little bit of learning. We sort of went to the library, so to speak, and tried to say, what can we learn from other sectors and the work they've done to think about disproportionality? And if you're like me and sort of a nerd about these kind of things, there's a ton of really great reading you can do about improvement efforts around disproportionality in healthcare outcomes. But I think that actually some of the most compelling evidence base here is from the education sector. And so here we just cribbed a framework that was used by the OECD when talking about disparities in educational outcomes. And so they talk about thinking about equity in three different ways. The first way is a sort of minimum standards approach. So one way to think about that is, are 90% of third graders reading proficient across each and every group, right? So if we slice third graders up by race and ethnicity, by gender identity, by region, what are we seeing about differential rates of reading proficiency? And can we set a minimum standard and talk about whether folks are meeting it or not at the demographic level? That's one approach. Another approach is what they're calling impartiality. So this is basically trying to control for a lot of different factors to say, are outcomes apples to apples? So in a world where we could control for socioeconomic factors, is race and ethnicity a predictor of reading level? Is the way that you would approach things through an impartiality lens. And then thirdly, we've got equality of condition. So this is without controlling for socioeconomic factors. Is race and ethnicity a predictor of reading level in a community? So for me, what was really helpful about thinking about it through these three different lenses is that it started to become really clear to our team and in conversation with partners and some folks with lived experience that likely the most straightforward and action-oriented approach for us to support communities to dig into their data is going to be through this minimum standards lens. So with that in mind, we started to think about what would it look like to apply a minimum standards lens to those three measures that we just talked about, to housing placements or positive exit rate, to returns to homelessness, and to length of time. And so here's our first stab at these three sort of operating definitions of how you might look at disproportionality and measure sort of an end to disproportionality across those three levels. And again, I think the hope today is to stress test these assumptions with you, to figure out if this feels like we're on the right track, and then to shed a bit of light on how we think you would actually operationalize looking at data in this way, and in the spirit of sort of establishing baselines and improving data on these three fronts. So we'll take a minute and walk through these three definitions. And don't worry, I know this is a fire hose of information. In a minute, what we'll do once we've walked through this is pause for about 5 minutes. I'll happily answer some questions from the chat, but we'll also have a survey just to gut check responses from y'all around how this is feeling so far. And we'll really spend the next hour plus just going really deep on what I'm about to cover. So the first of these three minimum standards that we think a community should be thinking about around racial equity is related to positive exits. And this is basically saying, of the people who've exited your homeless response system in the last 12 months, what percent exited to positive destinations? And then establishing a minimum threshold. So you might set a goal of 90% in your community, and maybe it's 70%, similar to sort of the approach that we've taken supporting communities with their inactive policy. There's going to be a little bit of local discretion here. But once you establish that minimum threshold, then what we're going to be looking at is whether or not different groups meet or are above that threshold. So that's positive exits. Next, applying that same minimum standards lens to returns to homelessness, we think that it makes sense to ask, for anyone with a positive exit date in the last 12 months, what percent have returned to homelessness and whether all groups are below a minimum threshold. So obviously we want to see the percent of returns being low. So lower is better here. So we're going to set, rather than a floor, we're going to set a ceiling as our threshold. So the goal here would be to think about it this way. Let's say that I've got 100 people experiencing homelessness in my community who have moved into permanent housing. I want to look at what percent of those folks return to homelessness, and I want to slice that up by different race and ethnicity categories, and maybe look intersectionally as well with gender identity or age or other factors that feel relevant in your local context, and then see which are the groups that are coming in below that standard. So for returns, we'd actually say, where are the groups where the returns to average are higher? And the first measure that we looked at around positive exits, we're going to be looking at where are the groups where the percent positive exits is below that threshold. So in terms of returns, we've got two pieces here. The first one I just talked through, and the second one, we're thinking about for anyone currently experiencing homelessness, what percent have had multiple episodes of homelessness, and does the proportion look the same across groups? So just a quick note on why we're talking about two separate blocks here, sort of a measure A and a measure B. Measure A is going to allow your community to look at data on all the folks who are not currently actively homeless, but sort of have an exit date and whether or not they returned. But we know that there's some folks who may be experiencing long-term homelessness in your community, and we want to have a way of thinking about that group of individuals as well. And so measure B here is a way that we can start to ask, who are the folks who are currently experiencing homelessness, and what can we glean about the extent to which they're experiencing episodic homelessness that's recurring, right? Because we know that often that might be a signal about something that's going sideways with our system. All right, so I'll just quickly mention the third leg of the stool here, which is length of time homeless. To me, this is in a lot of ways the most straightforward one. So here we're talking about the length of time from identification to move in. So it's not about just being matched to a voucher or having an assessment. We're talking about the moment that an individual experiencing homelessness first connects with your homeless response system, all the way until the day that their experience of homelessness is resolved, hopefully to a safe and stable destination. And what we want to look at there is establishing a community-wide threshold or goal. So maybe we'll say, we hope that in our community, everybody is able to be supported in resolving their experience of homelessness in no more than 90 days, right? I know that's ambitious. For some communities, it might be that that baseline today looks more like 180 days. We think that once you establish that threshold, that target, that goal, then we're going to be just looking at what percent of people meet that goal across different groups, and looking at whether there are some groups where they're below that threshold in a sort of an outlier way, so that we could set a goal to improve for them. And then there's a section B here too, because we know that long stayers are not going to have a move-in date, right? And so if we just look at the folks who have a date of identification and a move-in date, you're going to be missing part of the story. You're going to be missing all the people who are currently experiencing long-term or chronic homelessness. So for those folks, we just want to look at the proportion of the population that meets the long stayer definition. So let me put this in a really concrete set of terms, right? Let's say that again, we've got a sort of round number. We've got 100 people on my active by name list for veterans today. I would look at, of those folks, how many of them have been experiencing homelessness over 90 days, as an example. And then I would look at that group and slice it by different race and ethnicity groups, and then look at the proportion of that long stayer list and see where there are sort of folks who are above the expected threshold. So I know that's a lot of sort of conceptual jargon. The good news is that we have sort of a visual aid that I know for me is really helpful here. So some folks on our team, Kavya in particular, have done some awesome work to just mock up. What would it look like to start to look at this in a chart? How could you start to just wrap your arms around what this might look like? And so I'll just quickly give you guys a sneak preview of a tool that I think we're hoping to be able to support communities to use this summer. For folks who are able to establish this kind of data analysis and baseline today, totally no pressure to use any kind of built for zero tool. We think lots of communities are already doing this, but wanted to just briefly show, and can folks just confirm, are you able to see that chart? I just switched tabs, but all right. So the idea of a minimum threshold approach is basically a one where you could just slice your data by different race and ethnicity categories, and then just look at who's above and below the thresholds. So here we're using color to just shout out to us. Orange is above the threshold, and those are the groups that we want to focus in on. Blue are the folks who are sort of in the clear, right? And so just being able to slice your data by different races and ethnicities in this way. So nothing super sophisticated, right? But you do have to have quality data already, client level data, to be able to do this. But I think this is just to give you a sense of when we say minimum standards, what we're talking about is taking some of the guesswork out of it and just being able to drill down. And I'm just going to zoom in. I'm realizing it might be a little small for folks to see. Just going to refresh. And so the theory here is just to look at those three measures that we just talked about. So the housing placements or positive exits, returns to homelessness, and length of time homeless, and to just slice them up, by category. So again, definitely don't need to go too deep into this chart. Just an opportunity for folks to start to wrap their head around the approach that we might take to look at the data, which is to say, you might just have a series of bar charts and then a line, and just look at whether the bars are above or below the line, right? Sort of whether they're above or below the threshold. So that's the idea here, is to try and simplify it. Because I know that often when we're talking about disproportionality, what we're doing is comparing groups all the time and looking for outliers. But I think that can get pretty complicated pretty quickly, especially because you can start to get lost in, well, how much variation from the system average feels like an acceptable amount. And I think that's a totally valid approach, but is one that feels pretty tough to try and pin down. And instead, if we frame things in terms of whether or not groups are meeting a minimum standard, it becomes a lot clearer in our experience to have unequivocal conversations about where we want to focus our improvement efforts. Okay, so like I said, I know that's a ton of information, but I'm going to pause here. If folks have questions, feel free to keep putting them in the chat and our team will keep answering them. But like I said as well, the goal here is for us to just give you guys a quick download of our thinking and then to dig into it together, to have a conversation about how these measures are landing, what blind spots we might be having, and whether folks feel like this is right track and operationalizable. And then also for folks who've already started digging into this data locally, we'd love to hear what you're learning and what has felt generative to you in the local conversations and improvement work you're all a part of. So I'll pause here and pass it over to my colleague, Caitlin, who's gonna share out a survey where we're hoping to get feedback on all of what I just walked through so that we can have a discussion that digs in further.
Awesome. Thanks, Ross, for that excellent presentation. Thank you, everyone, for participating here in the chat. I've seen a lot of really great questions. That shows me you're really starting to try to sink your claws into what it is that these measurements would mean for your communities. So that's really exciting. And I'm hoping to keep that participation ball rolling in the chat. But there are also a couple of other ways that you can submit feedback today. So before we jump into those, I wanted to go over with you what all your options are. We are a group of about 150 today, so unfortunately we're not going to be able to take you off mute. Just that would get complicated and noisy. So we are trying to open up a couple of different avenues for you to provide feedback today. So one, like Ross said, there will be a couple of surveys today. We'll drop the links into the chat. There's also a QR code so you can open up your phone. And if you sort of hover your phone over it, normally a little link appears. You can click on it and it will take you to the survey. There is also a notes template that will cover everything that we're talking about today. So if you are someone that likes to take a little bit of time to process what it is that we're talking about today, but you still want to make sure that we hear that, go ahead and fill out the notes template that will drop in the chat as well. And you can be taking notes as you're hearing things in the conversation and seeing things through the exercises. And then if you would email those notes to anybody on this call, especially me, because I'll probably be looking at them and synthesizing them into the final output of the final draft that we're going to send around to folks. do that. We would love to hear from you, even if you don't think as quickly or don't want to type as quickly. And then in addition to that, we'll be doing some exercises here on the screen in a tool called Mural that Shantae will be driving for us. And you can type into the chat box and your comments will appear on the mural that we're about to do. So without further ado, I'm going to have Shantae pop us into the mural space. All right, I am not yet seeing it. If you can see it, give me a thumbs up. Not yet?
Not yet. I wonder, Shantae, if you want to exit it and just redo it. I feel like sometimes it can be a bit finicky.
Why don't I give a stab at sharing it real quickly?
Oh, we had it just then, Shantae, if you want to pull it back up. Looks like she.
I'm gonna
Sorry,
go ahead.
my computer's doing some really weird things, so just give me a minute if someone else wants to pull it up.
No worries.
Yes, I will go ahead and do that. And then Shantae, if you'll just jump in and let me know whenever you're ready, we'll transfer it back over to you.
Awesome.
Thanks, Caitlin.
Okay. Are folks able to see my screen okay?
Yes.
Awesome. Great, thanks. So before we launch into a conversation about race equity, I wanted us to set some ground rules about how we want to participate today. Typically, whenever we get together in person, we'll sit together and we'll talk about community agreements we want to have for a space. A lot of places I've been use the term safe space to describe wanting to have a situation in which everyone feels comfortable and able to share and don't feel threatened. However, we find that because we live in a white dominant culture, whose definition of safe gets used is often that of white people. And as we all know, whiteness loves comfort. And so we are trying to intentionally step out of a safe space in order to have what we're calling a liberated space. This is not something that Community Solutions or the Built for Zero team made up. But Martin Urbach via Medium has a really great article on what a liberated space is and what it means that I think Esther will link in the chat if you want to read more about it. But I wanted to read out a quote about the kind of space we're trying to create here today and some of the agreements that we want to have in this space while we're talking about race and race equity in measures today. So I will go ahead and read this quote in case it's a little small on your screen. It says, "A liberated space is a space grounded in community and love. It is a space where we are free, or libre, to be human along one another. And since to be human is to err, a liberated space is a space where a mistake or a transgression will not cost us our freedom. That being said, in a liberated space, we will process whatever intentional and unintentional hurt or pain is caused by our words or actions, and that is caused upon us. A liberated space is a space in which everyone works as a team to restore that which has been broken. We all play a part in doing so. In a liberated space, we all hold each other accountable for doing so. We protect each other." And a line in that article that I think really summarizes it much more succinctly is, "In liberated spaces, we struggle together, we are committed to one another, we mess up, we process, we apologize, we learn, we live together." I think this acknowledges that there can be a lot of conflict and uncomfortability in conversations about race, and that is okay, that is allowed here. And at the same time, we want people who are hurt by anything that's said to be able to say, "Hey, that hurt me." And we want people who say those things to be able to say, "Ooh, I didn't quite mean that. Let me try again. How can I repair that harm that I've done?" So in that spirit, we have some liberated space agreements that I wanted to go over today. So The first one is that there is room for saying ouch. So if someone did something that hurt you, it is okay to bring that up and to talk about it and to say how that affected you. You also have the option to say, oops, that came out wrong. I didn't mean to say that, or I said something that was messed up and I want to explain myself or heal that which has been broken. And at the very, very bottom, we have, you could say, yeah, you're right. It's really a great thing to do to validate one another in community, to feel like we belong together and we can share an experience. So if you want to +1 something anyone says about your experience, or about a comment or a question that you have, it's totally okay to +1 that. I am currently not able to see the chat. Has anyone brought up anything that we need to address before we move on?
No, just some folks saying that they love the Liberated Space Agreement.
Oh, great. Good. All right. I'm glad that's working for you. I wanted to open up space as well for if anyone has additional agreements that they would like to bring into the space. I will say, because this is going to be limited to commenting in the chat, that some of our standard, one mic, one diva agreements aren't quite going to work in this format. But if you do have ones you want to put up there, I will ask Aras or Kavya to copy paste those into here, and we will have those be part of our agreements today. So I'm going to give us just a minute or so to do that. And I got a message.
I think we're all good, Caitlin. I'm going to go ahead and take over screen sharing so that you can get back into the sort of captain's chair here. So if that's okay.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. I do find it easier to only be doing one thing at once, so I appreciate that.
All right. Can you confirm that you can see my mural screen? And I probably got to zoom in a little bit.
Confirmed.
Awesome.
Can you zoom in a little more? It's
of course
small on my screen. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so I'm not seeing any additional suggestions for our community agreement, so we're going to move forward with these 3. And now we are going to move into a feedback session. So Esther, have you dropped in the notes document into the chat?
Dropping now.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I would love for everyone to do 1 or 2 of the things that I'm about to explain. The first one is, if you are not someone that feels comfortable sharing things live, or you want to have more time to think about things, go ahead and click on this link. It will download a Word document to your computer. You can open it, you can write on it, and then whenever you are done and feel like you're in a good place to share, you can email it back to one of us. I don't know if I put my email address in there, so I'm going to go ahead and stick it here, so that way you can copy paste it into your document. And then the second thing I'm going to have Esther do is paste in our first survey. This first survey is gauging your thoughts around the equitability. So how fair or equitable do you think that the measure is? Around how easy it is to understand, around how possible it is to achieve, and around how possible it is to measure. And there's like a red light, green light, yellow light measurement schema in there. So I think most of that is pretty intuitive, but essentially green light means you feel good about moving forward with it. Yellow light means you have some serious concerns that you would want to see before moving forward with it, or sorry, that you would want to see fixed before moving forward with it. And then red light is, ooh, we need to stop the car and turn it around. In addition to the survey link, if you find it easier to do so on your phone, or else if you scooch over to the right on the mural and zoom in, there is a QR code, and you can take a picture of that with your phone. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to put myself on mute for the next 3 to 5 minutes. The survey is pretty easy. As far as like the functionality of it goes, it may not be hard, or it may not be easy for you to suss out your answers in your head, but I'll just sit for about 3 minutes and let folks fill that in. And I'll ask at the end of 3 minutes if you need more time, so please don't feel rushed.
And Caitlin, will you give us a quick foreshadow of where we're headed after those 3 minutes, just so folks have a sense of how we'll use this information?
That is an excellent thing to mention. Thank you, Ross, for prompting me to do that. So after this, I'm going to be able to look at responses. I will not know whose response is whose. But I'm looking at the distribution of responses on the back end, and we are going to talk through why we answered certain ways on certain questions where there are areas of divergence. So if a lot of folks feel like this is green and a lot of folks also feel like this is red, let's talk about why we're red or why we're green. I'm going to have you put things into the chat box if that's something you feel comfortable doing. There will be a follow-up survey, so if you don't feel comfortable sharing in the chat box, you can always put it confidentially in the survey later, but you may want to just take a note that you want to include that. And we'll do that for each of the measures, and I'll ask us some prompting questions. So this is just to give me an idea about where everyone in the room right now stands on their comfortability and to allow us some more space to explore. Yes, please do the survey now. Go ahead and click on the link, look into the QR code, and go ahead and fill out the survey. I'm gonna, like I originally said, I'm gonna put myself on mute for about 3 or 5 minutes while we wait for those responses to come in. And do pop into the chat if you are having technical access issues, and we'll see what we can do.
All right, and as folks are filling that survey out, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and Shantae, pass it over to you if you're ready to go. Awesome, golden. Will you zoom in a little bit, Shantae? I think it's just a bit small. Perfect.
All right, we got like 30 seconds left. So I'm going to say if you're still taking the survey, go ahead and try to finish up. And just know that you have more time to fill this out as we're going through the exercise. So don't panic. It's also optional, so also don't panic. All right, I believe that is the end of the time. I'm going to go ahead and refresh this survey back end. Ooh, y'all, we got 66 survey responses. That just makes my heart sing. Thank you guys for being willing to take that. I think it's going to give us a lot of good starting points for conversations to have as we move forward through today. So I'm going to go ahead and move us into the next activity. Oh dear, the thing just beeped at me. Oh dear. Okay, so we're going to do a check on the spread of the questions that we got on the survey back end. And what's going to happen is that I'm going to ask questions of the group about why you answered a certain way. And if you would like to, you can comment in the chat about why that is, and either Kavya or Ross will put your comment on the side of the scale that you're on. And the intention behind this is to give folks more information and different points of view that they may not have considered when they put their answer in. Like I said, there's going to be a survey at the end. So if after this discussion you decided, oh, that was actually a good point, and I don't actually feel like that's actually a good idea anymore, great. That is part of what this discussion is for, is to get more information. So I am going to have us start with what we think about the concept of a minimum standard outcome. It looks like most people here were in either green light zone or yellow light zone. So I would love for folks that answered in yellow light. Why did you answer yellow light and not green light? What were those things that were holding you back? If you feel like you want to respond.
We haven't started yet. We're still kind of in the process of development.
That makes sense. So you're just sort of unsure right now.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Also cool, I didn't realize people could unmute themselves. This is fabulous. I would love to actually get some verbal answers. I just didn't think it was possible.
Shantae, could you zoom in on the question? I think it's a little tiny. Perfect. Thank you.
All right.
Oh, sorry. We also haven't started yet, but one thing that I was kind of confused on was, how is it different than targeted universalism?
That is a good question, Megan. I think it's just the name that's different.
It's the
Is that,
exact same.
no, Aras, is that different? Oh yeah.
Yep, nailed it.
Cool, okay.
Good question, Megan, thanks.
I wasn't clear where you have different percentages of population of different groups in your homeless community, whether the minimum standard for everybody should be the same.
Got it. Okay, so unsure if the minimum standard should be the same across racial groups. Got it. Cool. Thank you, Howard. And if you were green and easy to understand, is there a reason, I guess, in particular why you were green? I guess it's same confusion as Howard, Laura. Great. Thank you. So we got a +1 there. We also have a comment from Desiree that Northern Colorado has a high proportion of white citizens, and it feels like we haven't yet implemented a strong focus on racial equity. HMIS implementation is on the way, but I don't find that we have appropriate measurement tools. Also, many people do not like to answer race questions. Awesome, thank you, Desiree. Something that I find interesting about this particular feedback section is that we have a lot of yellow lights around whether or not this is possible to achieve. So if you are a yellow light for whether or not it is possible to achieve this outcome, why are you yellow and not red?
Hi, this is Bobbin. I think I got confused between the, but in the survey, not with, sorry for the dogs, not with the question, but with the survey itself. And so possible to achieve versus possible to measure. So when you say possible to achieve, do you mean to achieve the outcome that we want?
Yeah,
So,
could we get there?
Okay, so, because I think that we can achieve the outcome eventually, but possible to measure gets a little trickier just in terms of pulling certain data elements out of HIMSS, right? And I know that I've had that conversation with you or us. So, but I was confused between possible to measure, like we could measure it, but can we get it out of HIMSS? And then possible to achieve, I think we could achieve a minimum standard, but again, I'm not sure we can achieve the ability to measure it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, the first step to achieving it is being able to measure it, I think, or in a way.
Totally. Hillary Evans also mentions that measuring is where they feel the most iffy, just because it's very reliant on data quality. All right, does anyone else have something burning that they would like to contribute to this conversation? Let's see, Ali Alexander says that she agrees, and her concern comes primarily from obtaining accurate data due to lack of representation in service providers. Okay.
Caitlin, I think I also, like, even as I was reading this, I was thinking minimum standard outcomes. Like, I get why we're using that language. I understand that language. That language doesn't feel good, right? Why are we setting a minimum standard? Like, that's why I kept saying, yes, as a starting point, right? Yes, this could start a conversation, but I don't even want to go out to my community and say, this is the minimum standard that we want to achieve for racial equity, because that's not going to sit well. So I feel like the word minimum there is uncomfortable.
Okay, great. Do you have an idea about what might work better? I think that's really valid feedback. I wonder if you have any thoughts about what you'd prefer it to be. Ooh, achievement target, Scott Clark says. That's cool.
I think that I think that if you're framing it in this concept of like, I like the word threshold, or a target, like, I think you have to just, it's also in the communication, and you have to frame it as, we need to set a standard at which we want all groups to achieve. So standard, I like. Achievement, I think someone said in the chat, threshold. I'm uncomfortable with the word minimum when we're talking about racial equity, as though we would settle for a minimum, right? And that doesn't sit well.
100%. Yes, language is super going to matter there, especially as people read into sort of different meanings about what that might be. Thank you, Bobbin. And we have a lot of great suggestions in the chat. Just know that if you put things in the chat, even though it may not appear out here, we're doing our best, but y'all are fast. And we will export this chat and make sure that we incorporate anything that ends up in the chat into our synthesis as well. So don't type faster. Garen, I shake my fist at you. All right, I'm going to have us move on to the next area. So I'm going to remove this little cover, and we're going to hop on over to our first outcomes standard. It looks like we have a little bit of concern around whether or not this particular measure is equitable. So we have about an even proportion between folks that are in the yellow light and folks that are in the green light. So yellow light folks, I wonder if you would surface some of your concerns for us. It's not easy to understand. Thank you, Laura. Brenda is uncertain about the data. I think there's a lot of uncertainty just because we're not really sure what the data is going to look like at this point, which is totally valid. Hard to make decisions if you don't have any information. Yep. We have fears about housing affordability. And Andrew Kramer says that this feels more like a measure of equality than equity. That is a really cool distinction to draw. Andrew, are you able to say more about that either in the chat or with your voice?
Sure. I mean, I've been thinking of where to go with it that's helpful, other than to say that, it just, in my community, we see people who identify as Black entering homelessness at 3 times the rate that they appear in our overall population. So, I mean, just for all of these, it just feels as though looking for the same outcomes isn't necessarily moving the needle in terms of the overall equity goals we have in our community. And I think that was something maybe what Howard was trying to say a little earlier.
Okay, great, thank you, Andrew. Hillary says that this measure feels straightforward and fair market value is not current for the area with realistic goals to fit into the housing box. That's you're not alone in that boat, Hillary. Hillary Erickson, different Hillary this time. 2 Hillarys. I know, it's a Hillary party. I feel so honored.
I've never been in another training with a Hillary. That's really weird.
Y'all got to exchange information later. You can have a Hillary club. Something else that I wanted to surface in this area is that there are also a lot of folks that feel like this would be really possible to measure, but less possible to achieve. I wonder if the folks that were green light and possible to measure would tell us what gives them confidence that they can measure this. Hillary Evans says that this is one that's already built into HMIS. And she also says that it's easy to run an exit report with race and ethnicity in their HMIS system. Bauman has a yes and about positive outcomes are one thing. Looking at what neighborhoods folks exit to is also going to be important. Moreno says that HMIS has a built-in report, and Bobbin adds that this is something that is shown in system performance measures, or SPMs. All right, and then last but not least, under possible to achieve, I wonder if our green lighters could say what gives them confidence that they'll be able to achieve the goal around this area. Oh, Laura Lama also says the LSA or Stella tool will help be able to measure this. That's very cool. All right, I'm going to go ahead and move us on unless anyone has something burning that they would like to add to the conversation, which if you do, please do. We're going to move over to question 3. Shantae, will you let me know how we're doing on time for feedback? I haven't been keeping an eye on the clock. All right, great, thank you. Okay, we're now going to move on to question 3, as I said before. An area that jumps out for me is that we have about 80% of folks who say green light. This is very easy to understand, but we do have some people in the red light area, so more than I guess I would expect there to be. So if you are in the red light area or the yellow light area for question 3, can you help us understand what would make it clearer?
I don't know if we're talking about all of this, but I thought it was easy to understand, but for the community I work for, at least Metro Denver, we don't really have any way to measure people coming into our system that have exited. We don't have like a method to do that.
Gotcha. So it's difficult to tell once you've exited someone to housing whether or not they're re-entering your system?
Yeah, and if they do, like it's more based off like, this sounds terrible, but like me recognizing their names or seeing that I put a note in their profile years ago. Like it's there's not like any kind of way to truly track people re-entering our system and in a timely way.
Got it. Yeah. So it sounds like you would need some more help trying to figure that out in your community for this to be something that was possible to measure or to understand in your community. Great. Thank you, Megan. Another thing I'm interested in around this question is our number of folks that think that this is an equitable measure. So if you are in the yellow light section for whether or not this is equitable, I would love to hear why you're yellow and not red.
I'm not sure, Caitlin. I think that, and people are saying it, that gets to access. And so folks can not be housed anymore, but not be, quote, all the way homeless, so that they might not be captured. So in that way, it may not be equitable. And that could be a lot of issues around access.
Yeah, so there's going to be some folks that are sort of dropping through the holes on this measure, and it doesn't address access as an issue. Great, thank you, Bobbin. Let me check the chat here. We have a question from Janice about if there are limits to accessing a program in the system within 12 months of being housed. Janice, can you say more about that?
Yeah, I think of different access points to a coordinated entry system, and I don't know that, you know, everybody's sort of like earlier today said, in the same boat, rowing in the same direction on that. So if, you know, in our program, if someone was successfully housed, and then they tried to return to our access point, I feel like there's some tension on allowing them to return to shelter. And I feel that I have to do some advocacy to get them to come back into shelter. And mine is, I'd rather them come see me before they become unhoused again, so maybe I can help prevent it. But these lines are not quite like these paths back to your case manager or to call us if you're if you need that assistance. That's not very clearly defined as a clear access point. So I feel that there are limits in programs in different access points. And I think that prevents us from being able to say in the last 12 months how many people have returned if we're not accepting them back into the, or being open to trying to assist, you know, in some way. I mean, we're all funded in finite, like the line goes in one direction, not backwards, not up,
Right.
not down. So I get that it's hard for someone to see it in a circle, but that's what I meant. If that makes sense, it doesn't, it's me asking a question like, well, how can we really measure that if there might be some barriers to accessing an access point in 12 months?
Got it. So I think, again, that's a second time we've heard just a question about access and whether or not people are going to fall through the cracks, and how are we going to measure when there are these more informal touch points and where someone might not formally enter a homelessness system. Is that an accurate summation, Janice? Did I miss something?
No, you didn't miss it. Thanks.
Okay, good. I just want to make sure I heard you right.
I want to name something else that I'm hearing as a theme here, Caitlin, which is I think the folks who are saying this feels possible to measure are often pointing to reports in HMIS. But then on the flip side, I'm hearing we know that there are some limitations around those reports in HMIS because they may not be capturing the entire universe of people. So if that's something that resonates in your community, will you just let us know in the chat? I think we're thinking a lot about HMIS as a vehicle to do some of this kind of analysis, but then the limitations that might exist if not all service providers are participating, or if certain types of individuals or programs are not being represented there.
It looks like we have a couple of +1s. Yeah, folks seem to say that they're missing a chunk. Okay, Great. I'm going to move us on to the next question. So I think I need to get in there and delete another box. We're going to move down and over a row. If you still have more that you'd like to explore, keep typing in the chat or on your notes document. Don't want to cut you off just because we're running out of time. You obviously have lots of time after this is over to submit any additional thoughts or comments that you have. Okay. Ooh, we've got a really interesting spread around whether or not number 4 is possible to measure. I would love for our red light folks, we have more red light folks here than we've had in one so far. I would love for you guys to share, why are you a red light? Or what feels difficult about measuring this?
I can go for, I was a red light for this one.
Yeah, go ahead, Maribel.
Okay, yeah, so for me, it's one of the hard things is how do we define homelessness? You know, if somebody's staying with a friend for a while, if they're kind of couch surfing back and forth between a couple of people for X period of time. I think that's always the hard part where we're kind of having those discussions on homelessness in those kind of gray areas where maybe they are indoors a lot of the times, but outdoors other times. So that's one struggle, is just getting to a consistent definition, because a lot of times I've had clients that are literally sleeping in the park and don't consider themselves homeless. So if you ask a client how many times you've been homeless, that's not always the best way to get at that question. It's more of asking what their living situation has been.
That's spot on, Maribel. Homelessness, especially episodically, can be full of gray area. It's definitely something we're going to want to think about. Thank you for bringing that up. And Laura says that a lot of homelessness happens outside of the HMIS system, so episodic homelessness will be hard to measure. So that sounds like a +1 to your point, Maribel. Matthew says he can pick out this measure, but people across the community have widely varying opinions on the definition of a homeless episode. So it sounds like we're really needing to put some guidelines around being precise about what counts as homeless, and what a definition of an episode would be, or just allowing for more gray area, because human beings have a lot of gray area. That makes a lot of sense. Bobbin has a comment about relying on self-report and how that's not always accurate. We've also got a lot of yellow lighters and whether or not this would be possible to achieve. And I wonder if our yellow lighters could say why they are not red. So why do you have a little bit of hope instead of being like, nope, not possible? Or no, we need to totally rethink this measure, I guess is more what red light says. Hunter says that their COC has challenges following all individuals after assessment. So consequently, it's challenging to track additional episodes or breaks. Matthew, I relate really hard to your comment about spending maybe a little bit too much time trying to get vaguely legalese about what homelessness is. That is a perennial problem in this work. But I've been in that situation on maybe too many happy hours. Megan Morales says, our shelter and day centers do not use HMIS and only have coordinated entry for the last couple of years. Bobbin suggests setting definitions locally. And Howard mentions that episodes are very reliant on self-report and it just feels fuzzy. Okay, thank you all. I'm going to move us on to the next one. I don't want us to run out of time. As I mentioned, don't feel like this is your last chance to give feedback. We've got a second survey coming up. And also we have the notes document, plus you know where to find us. I put my email in the chat. I'll do it again at the end. So you can always find me. I love talking about this. Oh, y'all are all making me so happy with the answers to this question, insofar as a lot of people feel like this is clear, which is great. I always like it when people can understand the question. And we also have a lot of folks that feel like this is an equitable measure. If you were in the green light category where you feel like this is an equitable measure, can you say why? So follow-up question to that, if you were yellow in whether or not you feel like this is equitable, why are you yellow and not green? What concerns do you have?
When they come up and use our, shelters and stuff.
Catherine says they think it measures quality of service delivery across all groups of clients. Great, I think that was probably a comment for the why are you green? Thank you, Catherine. Laura has a clarifying question about whether first contact simply means the day that they enter the system. I would say first contact is when anyone that is serving homeless persons within your community makes contact with that person and becomes aware of their existence.
We've got a couple homes.
Paul says that their street outreach is trying to get better at finding encampments, but needs a better way. Great, Paul, thanks.
She's without a domicile. That's how I.
Another place where we have a lot of folks right in the middle is around whether or not this measure is possible to achieve. About 51% of folks are in the yellow light area here, and we've got about 10% of folks in the red light area. So red light folks, I would love for you to tell me what it would take to move from a red light to a yellow light here. And just know that there are a bit of you, so you're not alone, and that's okay to disagree with things.
I think we would need to start by defining what data first contact was, especially because I mentioned before, like our community doesn't use it for shelter, use HMIS for shelter, or for day centers, and even our outreach team is private, so only system admins can see it. So it's just really hard to like tackle how we even start this calculation.
Yeah, that can feel really overwhelming.
I'm sorry, really quickly, Megan, can I ask you a clarifying question? When you're saying that it's private, are you referring to that's more like a data sharing agreement within your community?
Our outreach provider, they just don't, they enter into HMIS, but they don't, the agency or the program is marked as private, so only system admins can see it. So it's not that it's not in HMIS, it's just that like myself as a coordinator, like I can't see any of the data. And then I can't pull it into reports either.
Interesting, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Kiana says that they know there are barriers as it relates to identifying housing, especially when it comes to criminal backgrounds that are involved. Totally. Laura says that they would like to see adopted a definition like the ESG street outreach definition of first contacts across all programs. It's a cool idea, Laura. Howard mentions that one of the issues here might be that first contact occurs faster for some groups than for others. So that does take into account that issue of access that we seem to be circling around as well. Great, thank you guys. Okay. Oh, Bobbin suggests a new question should maybe center around equity and access. It's a good suggestion, Bobbin. Let me go back to our mural. I'm going to move us over one to the right. This is going to be our last one, so thank you for sticking with me. So for our last one, it is about experiencing homelessness for over the minimum standard, 90 days. It looks like a lot of people feel like this is a pretty equitable measure. Can you say why you are a green light rather than a yellow light? What gives you confidence here as far as equitability goes? What about if you were a yellow lighter in this area? Why are you a yellow light? Excuse me. Why are you a yellow light and not a green light? Pamela mentions that each person has unique issues. Pamela, are you able to say more about that? That's okay.
Yeah, I just
Oh,
wanted
you
to
are.
say, I mean, I think when I think about serving this population, when I struggle with trying to group them, right? So that everybody in this group is going to have this. So I just have to think about each person has unique issues. The outreach has to be different with each individual person. So I just struggled with the wording in the question and that word same across groups. That's my struggle with it.
Okay, thank you, Pamela. It's just trying to
Yeah.
recognize the unique needs and issues each group is going to face and how do we regulate across that.
Right, right.
Great, thank you, Pamela. Got my good friend John Meyer from the Texas Balanced Estate COC in Abilene. He mentions, oh, his thing had just scrolled up to the top. Where did you go, Scott? Or not Scott, John, there we go. Communities have in-service area. If housing is not available, then it's not available to anyone. That's an interesting point, John. Yeah, so if housing is generally unavailable, it's going to be generally unavailable for most people in your particular area. That makes sense. Stella, thank you for bringing some representation of the Indigenous population into this conversation. They have a homestay in Utah, but they are homeless in Colorado. And they use the shelter and other services as homeless populations that really are not without housing. Interesting. So when someone has housing elsewhere and is in a community where they don't have housing, how would you deal with that? That's interesting, Stella. Janice mentions increased barriers, perhaps in the mental health system or for sex offenders that are not eligible for as many housing options, excuse me. And Bobbin mentions that there are just a lot of other factors that would play a role in this measure. Hillary Erickson brings up that there's just a general housing affordability issue in the area and folks just can't afford to live there. There's limited jobs and housing. And if they don't qualify for HUD through their income, it can be a really big barrier. Okay, great, y'all. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and close us out on this section. of feedback. Thank you all so much for being willing to speak up and let us know what your thoughts are, where you're confused, what your ideas are, and how we can make these measures be more equitable. Our next steps with this, in addition to the survey I'm about to launch for you guys, is to be able to take all of your feedback and draft it into another draft. Maybe should have used a different verb than draft, so I wouldn't say it twice. But we are going to be taking all of your feedback into account. We're going to be making revisions, and we want you guys to see it again to see how your input has changed it over time. Not over time, through the feedback, excuse me. I've got longitudinal analysis on the brain. All right, great. So let's go ahead and launch that second survey. Esther, if you would please. This second survey is about whether or not, due to this conversation, any of your viewpoints have changed, but it also has something about a race equity pilot in it where we're going to gather some interest on testing some of these. Ross, would you tell us more about what that's all about?
Yes, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and walk through a couple slides around next steps. All right. Can y'all confirm you can see my screen? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. So, as we discussed, I think the idea here is to start to think about moving into action. Today is really about level setting and gut check moment to say, does this feel like it's generally in the right track? And we're going to, as Caitlin said, incorporate all the amazing feedback y'all have offered us to try and come up with a better first draft of this before we support communities to start to test and implement looking at some of these measures on a regular basis. So the theory or approach that we're suggesting is exactly targeted universalism. I can't remember who mentioned that earlier on the call, but that's exactly it. So the idea is, rather than sort of feeling like we're drowning in looking at comparative data month over month, which has been a little bit of the story that I've heard from some folks in the communities who've tried to dig into their racial equity, is that it can feel paralyzing to look at comparisons across groups all the time. That we're going to suggest that folks do a deep dive at least every 6 months to identify disparities across groups. In that moment, we're going to try and support you to do some analysis and documentation to say, based on our analysis, we think these groups are experiencing disproportionately sort of poor outcomes that don't meet these standards today, and then set some improvement targets. And then work over a period of, we suggest, in 6 months to sort of align with our cadence of these learning sessions happening every 6 months. So the idea would be that for a 6-month window of time, you focus in that targeted universalism frame to improve outcomes for that focused demographic or group. And so if we think about the sort of built for zero approach to sharing data and reporting and looking at that data regularly, we would just try and improve outcomes towards a goal. We wouldn't be looking at whether we're shrinking the gap month to month. We just look at improvement. And then hopefully doing that, at the end of that 6-month improvement cycle, we'll be able to do another deep dive, and we'll see that some of those disparities have been closed or those gaps have been shrunk. So that's the theory or approach that we're suggesting here. Again, would love to hear people's feedback to this, whether through that survey or the notes document. And so here's a bit of a timeline of how our team is hoping to support y'all in this work. So we heard a lot of great points today around data quality. And I think that just like with the work to reduce and end homelessness, for better or for worse, our ability to measure and track progress is going to be reliant on first leaning into some tricky questions around data quality. So our hope is that in June, we're going to support y'all to do that. The main ways that we're hoping to do that are to layer on some additional questions similar to the bi-nameless scorecard that y'all are familiar with that are going to help orient you towards some community level improvements or sort of provocations around data quality around race and ethnicity. So do we have that data and how is it getting collected? Who do we not have that data for? Is there anything we can do around data quality and completeness? Plus the big question of where are the gaps in our access? So who are the folks who are not showing up in our data set and what can we do about it? Then in July to November, we're going to be supporting folks to go deep on establishing those baselines using that quality data. Into the spirit of trying to identify some of those focused demographics for improvement work. And as Caitlin mentioned, I think there's a bunch that we've got to figure out in the implementation here. And so we're thinking about a pilot group of communities who are going to test drive some tools, infrastructure, and that we're going to try and leverage our data team in particular support to try and be sort of co-conspirators in helping y'all with analysis, particularly in places where it feels like barriers exist around data preparation, HMIS, best practices there. And then November onward, the goal is really for us to sort of have some of this racial equity analysis and improvement work get baked into what we think of as our business as usual for the initiative. So starting in November, basically every community is going to be invited to start to look at racial equity month over month through that targeted universalism frame, right? So we're going to invite folks to sort of document a focused demographic with some goals, and then track progress towards those goals, and hopefully be able to use some of the dashboards and standard processes that y'all already use as part of Built for Zero in service of that work. So that's a bit of light into where we're going. As I said, there's still a bunch of specifics that need to get pinned down, and our hope is that some of you will be willing to learn with us and alongside us over the next couple months to help make sure that this gets refined and evolved in the spirit of helping every community that's part of Built for Zero start to incorporate racial equity in their standard operating on a month-to-month basis. And again, I think one way that we want to try and do that is to support y'all with visuals that will hopefully help you take some of the concepts that I know we heard today are not always the easiest to understand, and to make them digestible to a broad set of stakeholders in your community. Because as Caitlin sort of mentioned at the jump, we know that in order for this work to take root, it's going to take more than just the folks on this call to be able to drive the work forward. We're going to ultimately need to be able to build sort of buy-in and trust and credibility across a wide set of stakeholders in our communities if we want to be able to actually do the improvement work, right? And so the idea is to start with the data analysis, but hopefully to make it digestible to a broad set of stakeholders in our communities, and then to use that data as sort of the North Star around goal setting and to track progress towards goals. Okay, Caitlin, Shante, Esther, Kavya, anything I missed that we should add here?
No.
Yeah, this was a really great generative session. I'm sorry, Shante, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
Nothing. I was just saying, no, I don't think that there's anything to add, and I would just +1 what you just said already. So
awesome. Grateful for all of you.
Awesome.
This feels like the exact kind of session that if we were in person together, we'd have big old wall maps up, have you guys up with sticky notes, putting stuff on the walls, maybe have a tool on a computer for you guys to prototype. Our hope is that sometime in the not too distant future, we'll be able to have that moment in person. But for today, in a virtual setting, I feel really, really grateful for everyone sort of showing up how y'all did. And definitely feel free to continue to give us your feedback on this. It's very much a work in progress, but we're going to learn a lot more in the doing, I think, in the days ahead. And so hopefully we can address some of those red lights in the next couple of weeks and be able to support y'all to hit the ground running to sort of dig into this and learn by doing. So thank all of you, and invite you to take this sort of follow-up survey as well. And definitely our contact info is in the chat. Keep in touch, but we'll hope to see you at some of the future sessions over the next couple of days. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, y'all.